A UFC first is about to go down. They've never done this before, but that is about to change in January of 2023. I'm talking about a fourth fight between opponents in the UFC. We've had trilogies. We've never had four fights between two of the same opponents. This one will happen between Brandon Moreno and Deiveson Figueiredo at UFC 283 in Rio de Janeiro. Now, of course, trilogies aren't that common in the fight game because you need the right mix of ingredients. In the UFC, it's pretty rare to have a trilogy over the 28 years or 29 years of whatever it's been that the UFC's been in business, but they do happen. And they happen somewhat frequently, enough to where fight fans want to look forward to it. We'll get one with Leon Edwards and Kamaru Usman when they rematch in 2023, as we expect them to do. Also, recently, Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier, they completed their trilogy in 2021. Although this one was a bit different, none of those three fights was for a UFC championship. The first one was in a different weight class when both of them were kind of rising in the ranks. And then, of course, in 2021, just mega fighters who have held the title, fought for the title, been interim champion. Conor was a double champion, and they completed their trilogy with the fight in January and then again in Las Vegas in the summer. The most epic recent trilogy that I can think of is Daniel Cormier against Stipe Miocic. That one was your classic one apiece. Got to do the third one for the rubber match with all the marbles on the line. Making it even better, DC won by knockout. Stipe won by TKO in the fourth round in their rematch 2018 and 2019. And then the worst part was COVID happened. 2020 comes along. DC wanted to retire, but of course, that fight was a big money fight. It was still hanging out there for him and Stipe to kind of determine who was the best heavyweight in UFC history. And they did it in front of dozens and dozens of people at the UFC Apex. Well, obviously that one could have lived up, and man, I would have loved it if that happened in front of a full arena headlining a pay-per-view in Vegas or New York City or something like that. But I digress. We're here to talk about the number 4 in a series between Deiveson Figueiredo and Brandon Moreno. Let's take a quick trip down memory lane. It was a pay-per-view headliner back in December of 2020. But beyond their epic first fight that ended in a draw, which is ultimately the reason why we need a fourth fight between these two, are the circumstances with which that happened. Less than a month before their first fight, if you recall, it was UFC 255. It was in November. Deiveson Figueiredo was the headliner. He was defending his flyweight title against Alex Perez. He beat him by submission within 2 minutes of that fight. Just got him out of there so quick, no damage. Earlier on that same card, Brandon Moreno beat Brandon Royval. Remember, Royval's shoulder popped out of his socket and allowed Moreno to finish Brandon Royval and get the victory with relatively little damage in that one as well. And Gilbert Burns was set to fight Kamaru Usman for the welterweight championship at UFC 256 in December. Usman needed a little more time to re-heal after he fought on Fight Island against Jorge Masvidal, so they had to push that one back to 2021, and that left the UFC needing a title fight. So they talked to Figueiredo probably that night. They talked to Brandon Moreno, and they said, can we do this? I think it was 3 weeks after they each fought on that same card. Figueiredo stays in town. He doesn't even go home to Brazil, does another weight cut, and it leads to that epic 5-round fight, which ends in a draw, if you remember, because Figueiredo had a low blow groin shot on Brandon Moreno, and he lost a point, and that led to the scorecards, leading it to a draw. They run it back in front of a full arena at Glendale, Arizona. What a scene that was when Brandon Moreno became the first Mexican-born champion by finishing Deiveson Figueiredo. And a superstar was born in the UFC. He immediately was thrust into the limelight. He was already a likable guy. He was already a bit of a fan favorite. But as a champion, that's a whole different level. He wore that crown well. And of course, the third fight made a lot of sense because a lot of people would say Figueiredo won the first fight without the point deduction. So they run it back for a third one, and that happened in Anaheim at UFC 270 in January of 2022. Unanimous decision victory for Deiveson Figueiredo. Moreno was disappointed with the result, the judges' scorecards, and immediately people are like, well, what do we do now? They made a quick interim flyweight title. Remember, Brandon Moreno fights Kai Kara-France earlier this year, and it was only a few months. I think they were, I don't know, it was a negotiating tactic, or if they thought Figueiredo, it's a tough cut for him to 125, that he would want to move up to 135 and start dealing with that Shark Tank and kind of chase legends as being a two-division champion. Moreno takes care of business against Kai Kara France, and that leads to the easiest match to make. We have to make it. I would not normally be a fan of a fourth fight in a series because it muddies the waters and then it's an even number and you start doing five and then it's bad. We're not like other sports where we do best of sevens. But in this case, it's a fight that makes sense. It's two of the best flyweights in the world. They have had great fights each time they've been locked in the octagon. And I think ultimately this will act as the, curtain call of the trilogy, with the first one being a draw. As long as we don't get a draw on this one, I think this will finally settle the score and we'll move on from here. And as I mentioned at the top, it'll happen in Rio de Janeiro. I mean, the stage is set for a perfect fight, a big fight, albeit in the smallest weight class on the men's side in the UFC. And it happens in the UFC's return to Brazil. First show in Brazil with the crowd since 2019. 2020, we did one there. It was the first event during the pandemic before the shutdown in Brasilia. Anyways, I want to know what you think of this fight. Comment below, leave a like, and January, we'll see what happens.